After I did a more theoretical video about different sensor sizes such as micro four thirds, APS-C and full frame, quite some of you asked me for a more practical and real-world review about a micro four thirds camera. And Panasonic was kind enough to lend me their brand new Panasonic Lumix G9 II along with two lenses. One is the also new 100 to 400 millimeter f4 to 6.3, and the other one is one that I asked for, and that's the 200 millimeter 2.8. I also got the 1.4 extender and used this a bit. And I have been using this equipment for a month now. I was shooting wildlife, mainly birds, but also some squirrels. And in this video I want to talk about my real-world experiences with the lens and the camera, so no studio tests, don't worry, just my experiences, because there were quite some things I liked, but also some things I didn't like so much, and definitely some surprises. So the camera has some really impressive specs. First of all, it's, as you can maybe see, a really professional built body. It feels nicely in the hand. It's about the same size, I would say, as my R5. It weighs about the same. I think it's 20 grams heavier than my R5, just to have this reference. It has one wheel on the left for changing the drive speed, like if you have a single shot, if you have burst, if you have timer and so on. On the right you have the different shooting modes, and then you have many buttons. I really love this red record button actually, and it also shows that this is a hybrid camera. It's really made for photo and for video. You have 3 dials here that you can use. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to put, let's say, the aperture on this dial here. I'm not sure if I did something wrong, but I only managed to assign shutter speed, aperture, ISO to these 2 up here, which is a bit a pity. I would have preferred to also use this 3rd dial. Apart from that, we have a joystick here as well to move the autofocus point around, and we have a lot of menu options. It took me quite a while to go through the whole menu to set the camera up in a way that I enjoyed it. And it was great. Some of the functions that you have, like you can also, for example, display the zebras, which is kind of an overexposure warning. On Canon you can only do this in the video mode, but here you can also do it in the photo mode, which depending on the type of shooting you do might be a good thing. What you also see, what makes the camera rather professional looking, is that you have 2 SD card slots instead of only 1. And on the other side you have a USB-C, and then above a full-size HDMI, so HDMI type A port, which is highly welcome. I was also quite happy with the battery life. What I didn't like though was that you didn't get a specific or dedicated battery charger. You just got a charger that charges over the USB-C, meaning if I empty one battery, I cannot swap it out, charge it and shoot with the next one. I always need to basically charge the camera directly and cannot use it then. One thing I noticed is that the camera sometimes feels a bit slow. For example, when I was in shooting mode and then I press the play button, you can see it takes a while until the picture appears. It's not really instant, and when you're not used to this, it happened to me that I pressed the play button, nothing happened, I pressed it again, and then I had the problem that I went out of the play again. The startup time was also not the fastest, but sometimes it was better, sometimes worse. I'm still not quite sure which factor influenced this. Something I really liked was the viewfinder. It's a very big viewfinder, has a nice resolution, so it was just a joy using it. One downside, however, is that if you shoot in manual mode, you cannot have an all-time preview of the exposure that you have, like you can have it with most other brands. You can have this exposure preview, it's called constant preview, you can set it, but from the moment you have pressed the shutter button or the AF on button, the camera basically goes to a mode where you don't have this exposure preview anymore, and I found this really annoying when exposing manually. Let's talk about the sensor and the image quality. So in the Panasonic Lumix G9 II, we have a 25 megapixel micro four thirds sensor. It has a feature to make like a 100 megapixel high resolution image. For wildlife photography, Obviously this is not very useful, so I actually didn't try it, but could be nice for other genres of photography. It's not a stacked sensor, but I found that the readout was fairly quick, so for usual things I didn't have a problem with rolling shutter. But I need to say I didn't do tons of actions just for seagulls in flight, ducks in flight. I didn't have a problem with distorted wings or things like this. When talking about the image quality, we should keep in mind that it's a Micro Four Thirds camera and not an APS-C or full frame. So on sunny days I was really happy. If it was a bit overcast but there was some snow around, it was also fine. However, on more heavily overcast days with some rain, when I needed to push the ISO more and go to 6400, there I was reaching a point where I was not happy with the image quality anymore, but I think this is just something that is in the nature of Micro Four Thirds cameras. And probably if you plan to shoot a lot during low light, you might be better off with another option. Although I need to say the lens also makes a big difference here. We will get to this a bit later. Very important for us wildlife photographers is of course the autofocus, and the G9 Mark II has also animal eye detection. Make sure that if you use it, you actually switch this on, because if you just put subject to track or subject to recognize and you just put animals, it usually just goes on the body, so you need to specifically switch to the eye detection, but then it worked overall quite well. I would say it's not the best on the market, but it was fairly good. And you can basically have this eye detection for all different autofocus modes, meaning like only one AF point that you can change in size, by the way, a zone, or over the whole frame. Depending on the situation, I use different modes, but I also found that the one over the whole frame actually works quite well. If you shoot a lot mirrorless cameras, you know that sometimes they tend to stick to the background and don't recognize a smaller bird in the foreground. And here Panasonic has a quite cool feature, I think. It has an AF near and AF far option. So if you choose the AF near, basically it tells the camera it should look for something closer than where it's currently focused. With the AF far option, you tell the camera it should look for something, for a subject to detect, that is farther away than where the focus plane currently is. And this was quite useful. Sometimes when the camera was stuck on the background, I programmed myself these two buttons here, one for closer and one for farther away, and then you can really pull or push the autofocus away. It worked in most of the cases. I would not recommend to always use this if you just have a bird that is close. I would always start with a normal autofocus, otherwise you can actually get it too close and make it focus on something on the foreground. But in this situation where it was stuck, it was quite helpful. However, I also need to say I found that this was more of an issue with this camera. I felt like other cameras that I used from different brands were not so clinging to the background. They were more easily switching to the actual subject. So I think it's a very nice feature. It's great that it's here, and it's very important that it's here for this camera, because it was more of an issue with this camera than with others that I have used. Overall, I felt that the autofocus performance was really better when there was enough light and contrast available, and on these darker days the camera was struggling a bit more, it was a bit slower, and overall the consistency was not perfect anymore. You just had some pictures that were not completely in focus. And where it was really struggling, also compared to other cameras that I used, was with snow, with heavy snowfall. I don't know, it was always going on the snow in front of the animal, and I was then trying with this far option to push it a bit back, but even there it worked sometimes, but it was very challenging. But I don't know how often you will shoot in snow. When taking pictures of birds in flight, I'm very happy about having a fast frame rate, because it just gives me more options to choose from in terms of wing position and so on. And this camera is an absolute beast there. It shoots 10 frames per second with the mechanical, or I think also first electronic curtain. Just be aware, with first electronic curtain shutter, you can only go to 1/2000th of a second, if I saw it correctly. With the mechanical, you go quicker. And 1/2000 is a bit, it's not ideal for me, so I stick to the mechanical or went to the electronic shutter, because as I mentioned, rolling shutter was not so much of an issue. And in the electronic shutter, you can go from 20 frames per second up to 60 frames per second with still continuous autofocus, and you can even combine it with this pre-burst, so that from the moment you put the finger on the shutter, half press the shutter, it starts like taking pictures and keeping them in the buffer, and when you fully press the shutter it starts recording and then adds this half a second, 1 second or 1.5 seconds before you press the shutter to it. So a very nice feature. However, I had one big problem with the electronic shutter, and this was when I was in the faster mode, so 20 frames per second or faster, I had a big lag in the viewfinder. Usually this lag, it was like freezing for a second, the viewfinder, and then continuing and then freezing again. Usually it was freezing for the first time when I was half pressing the shutter button or the AF on button, and afterwards, after 1 or 2 seconds, doing it again. And this made it for me incredibly hard to track subjects, because I'm like panning and at some point the image just freezes and then it continues. Maybe you can see it a bit in this clip here, but I can tell you in real life it felt actually worse. So I'm not 100% sure why this happened. I didn't get a response from Panasonic yet. I need to say that this was a pre-production camera, so it could be something with this. Maybe they will fix it with the firmware update. I can just say I reset all the settings because I was not sure if maybe I screwed something up, and it still happened after a factory reset. So I don't really know what it could be. What I then did basically for action shots, I went back to the mechanical shutter, which is a bit a pity because you drop to this 10 frames per second, which is still good, but it's a bit slower. And also the blackout with the mechanical shutter is quite big. I found this also not so easy to track birds, but actually still better than the electronic shutter with this lag. I need to say, when I was just taking pictures of squirrels, songbirds and so on, this lag was not so much of an issue. It was really just a problem when you were tracking some subjects. As I mentioned, this camera has some impressive features for filming. However, I wanted to focus a bit on the photography, so I will not cover this in this video. There are other videos that cover the filming or video aspects of this camera more in detail. So let's move to another topic, and that's kind of the background blur. And this was the reason I basically stayed away from Micro Four Thirds so far, because if you know my style of shooting, I usually like a nice, soft, out-of-focus background. And I need to say, of course, this is a limitation of Micro Four Thirds, of smaller sensors, but it also has a bit to do with the lenses. And if you want a cheap, or rather cheap option for camera and lens, also if you go for APS-C, you will also not get a very smooth background. It's just because of this rather inexpensive option you choose. And still, I'll try to go for a smoother background, and I need to say it definitely is possible if you know how to work with it, in some situations at least. So first of all, what I found, I liked the 200mm 2.8 so much more than the 100-400, just because you can get a, with this 2.8 you can get a softer background. Of course it requires that you go a bit closer to the animal, but I really enjoyed using this also with the 1.4 extender sometimes. It gave me great sharpness. I also had the feeling the autofocus was a bit faster, but not 100% sure here. And obviously the f2.8 also helps to keep the ISO a bit down compared to here, where you at 400mm you're at f6.3, so it's more than 2 stops less light that enters the camera. So what are my conclusions? Well, if you want a rather lightweight combination, but you still want to have a modern camera with professional features, I think the Panasonic Lumix G9 II is a very nice choice. The biggest problem I see is this lag in the viewfinder, so I hope this can be resolved via a firmware update. We will see. As I mentioned, I preferred the 200mm 2.8, but I guess for most people the 100-400 will be the more interesting choice because you just have more reach, and I feel that especially beginner photographers want this more reach. Here you get up to 800mm full frame equivalent focal length, and I think this will be highly welcome by many people. I hope you liked the video. I put an affiliate links in the video description. If you order through this one, it would help my channel. And just let me know if you have further questions, or if you would be interested in more Micro Four Thirds content in the future, maybe also different cameras, different lenses. Just let me know all your wishes, and see you in the next video.